We are learning more news about the incidents at the heart of an extraordinary standoff between the White House and Congress. The administration trying to keep a whistleblower's complaint under wraps, while Democrats are threatening legal action to get their hands on it. NBC News has already reported that the complaint focuses on a specific phone call from the president. And the Washington Post says it involved some sort of commitment he made to a foreign leader. The president tweeted that it was fake news and denied he would say anything inappropriate on such a call. But today, the Washington Post and the New York Times have even more details. According to people familiar with the matter, the allegation focuses on Ukraine. That is important because we know President Trump did talk to the Ukrainian president less than 3 weeks before the complaint was filed. I want to stop there and bring Ken Delaney in because this thing is complicated. Help us out here, Ken. NBC has not confirmed that Ukraine is part of the whistleblower complaint, but Ukraine has been in the news over the last few months for a couple of other reasons. So explain to me why those other reasons could be relevant to this complaint.
Absolutely, Stephanie. And you're right to point out that we haven't confirmed that this is about Ukraine. But congressional Democrats have already been investigating this matter of Ukraine and President Trump and the question of whether Trump improperly sought to pressure the Ukrainian president to reopen an investigation that involves Joe Biden and his son. And Rudy Giuliani, the president's lawyer, has been over in Ukraine and acknowledged that he has asked the Ukrainian government to reopen that investigation. There's a really interesting timeline of events here, Stephanie, where, on July 25th, the President Trump had a phone call with the Ukrainian president. And then shortly after that, Rudy Giuliani was over in Ukraine meeting with an aide to that president. Then after that, in August, the whistleblower files the complaint. And then shortly after that, there's some stories about a delay. The Trump administration is delaying $250 million in military aid to Ukraine. Then later in September, that aid is released. So, look, again, we don't know if this is the issue in the whistleblower complaint. But if it is, it would go a long way towards explaining this legal battle between the executive branch and Congress, because if it's about military aid and a promise to Ukraine, it may not actually technically involve an intelligence activity. And that would be why the DNI is arguing it doesn't fall under this whistleblower protection statute and it shouldn't be turned over to Congress. But that raises a much larger question, Stephanie, which is, if there's an allegation that President Trump committed misconduct in a conversation with a foreign leader, proposed a bribery or an extortion scheme, who in Congress is responsible for investigating that? How are they supposed to get information about it if the executive branch argues, oh, I'm sorry, the president's conversations with foreign leaders are privileged and confidential? That can't be true, congressional Democrats are saying, if he's doing something not in the interest of the United States, but in his own personal interest.
All right, that's what happened. Let's find out what it means. Digging a little deeper with Ashley Parker, Pulitzer Prize-winning White House reporter for The Washington Post, Jeremy Peters, politics reporter for The New York Times, and Michael Allen, former special assistant to President George W. Bush, a former member of the NSC and former staff director with the House Intelligence Committee, currently managing director at Beacon Global Strategies. Michael, I want to start with you. The president basically tweeting this morning that if any of this were true, a lot more people than one single whistleblower would have come forward. A lot more would have. What do you make of that argument?
Well, that's not necessarily true. It is the case that in the White House, there are numerous people who are listening in on the conversations. Absolutely properly, by the way, that's for the purpose of taking notes. A greater number of people see transcripts. But I don't think it's the case that just because one person has come forward that others wouldn't or couldn't corroborate that story. But this is going to set up yet another constitutional showdown between the rights of the Congress and the president's privileges vis-a-vis communications and what we generally call executive privilege. These seem to happen weekly in the Trump administration.
All right, Ashley, how close are we to connecting the dots between this complaint and all these news events that we've had going on involving Ukraine over the last few months? What are the puzzle pieces still missing?
Well, some of the puzzle pieces still missing is the key thing. The Post and the Times have reported that a key part of this whistleblower's concern involved Ukraine and a sort of pledge or promise the president made to that country's leader. But what we really want to know is, what was that pledge? What was that promise? What exactly did the president say? Did he say, as people are sort of surmising but have not, verified, because no one right now is able to talk freely, that the president seemed to threaten to withhold aid from Ukraine unless the country was willing to look into his political rivals for 2020? I mean, I think the key thing is what actually was the whistleblower's concerns. And we also know that while a key focus of the concern was this conversation that centered around Ukraine, there's also reporting that it wasn't just this one instance. It was a collection of concerns. So what are these other issues that prompted a whistleblower to take this pretty dramatic step?
All right, right there on your screen, I want to point out President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump waiting to greet the Prime Minister of Australia. Michael, I want to play for you how the Ukrainian government described that phone call in question. Actually, I have it here. Donald Trump is convinced that the renewed Ukrainian authorities will be able to quickly improve Ukraine's image and complete investigations into corruption cases that have hampered Ukraine-U.S. cooperation. Now, that might sound like a quid pro quo, but that wouldn't necessarily be unusual, because in this case, this quid pro quo would be about our country and our country's best interests. And the complaint in question is about the president's personal best interests.
You're onto something. Listen, I think if it were strictly, hey, listen, you need to get your act together on corrupt government officials in Ukraine, and then I'll send over the aid, I think that's totally permissible. But if it's to the president's political interest, i.e. investigate someone in particular and turn over dirt to me for my political use and my electoral benefit, that's a whole different kettle of fish. That's something else the House Judiciary Committee is going to want to investigate, and this is going to put greater pressure on Speaker Pelosi on impeachment proceedings.
Okay, would that be her only line of defense or attack, Michael? If the president did do this, would it be illegal?
This is a really hard case. I think if it's to his electoral benefit, it certainly might reach the levels of the standards in the Constitution about being high crimes and or misdemeanors. And so, that's intentionally vague. Sometimes it's in the eyes of the beholder. But I think that this is something that we could really see the House Judiciary Committee want to investigate, and they might actually be able to get somewhere.
Jeremy, we already knew that Rudy Giuliani, close friend, advisor to the president, had been overseas meeting with an aide to the Ukrainian president just in the last couple of months. He was asked about it last night on CNN, and I want to share what he said.
Did you ask the Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden?
No, actually, I didn't. I asked the Ukraine to investigate the allegations that there was interference in the election of 2016 by the Ukrainians for the benefit of Hillary Clinton, for which there already is a court finding.
You never asked anything about Hunter Biden. You never asked anything about Joe Biden.
The only thing I asked about Joe Biden is to get to the bottom of how it was that Lutsenko, who was appointed, dismissed the case against Antak.
So you did ask Ukraine to look into Joe Biden?
Of course I did.
You just said you didn't.
I want to laugh, but it's so alarming. It's not even funny. Jeremy, can you explain what in the world is going on right there?
Well, I won't pretend to know what's going on inside Rudy Giuliani's head, but I do think, Stephanie, we have a pattern here, which is that when the president does something that's inappropriate, his aides immediately go out and say, well, no, it's not inappropriate. It's perfectly fine. It's perfectly within the parameters of the law. And furthermore, we are not going to share any of our information with Congress or anybody who's investigating us because we have executive privilege and we're perfectly within our rights under the Constitution to do so. So they just try to shut this down early, and that's what they're trying to do in this particular case. I think, what you have is this really interesting constitutional showdown that's likely to unfold over the next few weeks here as the president, who has chosen an attorney general who takes a very expansive view of executive authority, is going to be battling with the House, which is going to say, no, you have to turn over these communications to us, and we want to know more information about it. And I mean, this is the kind of thing that you really could see eventually ending up at the steps of the Supreme Court.
Ashley, it was sort of Rudy Giuliani all over again. He tweeted that if the president had been telling the Ukrainian president to open these very investigations, he would have been doing his job. What do you make of that? To me, I'm hearing a Rudy Giuliani that we heard just before the Mueller report came out.
That's right. I mean, as Jeremy said, this is a president who he and his allies basically take some version of the argument that when the president does it, it's not against the law. When the president does it, it's absolutely okay and absolutely acceptable. And what you're seeing with Giuliani is with the Mueller report, as you mentioned, they were running not just a legal strategy, but at its core, a public relations strategy, which was coming out and being combative and going on the offense and not just trying to stall Congress and win there potentially, but to try to win in the minds of voters. Because depending what does happen with various investigations on the Hill, there is also a sense that if the president wins any argument in the court of public opinion, that is the thing that matters most for him and for his reelection chances in 2020.
But, Michael, there is an important distinction, because despite what happened in 2016, the president has said again he would be open to getting help from other countries. And I want to share specifically what he said in June of this year.
Your campaign this time around, if foreigners, if Russia, if China, if someone else offers you information on an opponent, should they accept it or should they call the FBI?
I think maybe you do both. I think you might want to listen. There's nothing wrong with listening. If somebody called from a country, Norway, we have information on your opponent. Oh, I think I'd want to hear it.
Do you want that kind of interference in our elections?
It's not an interference. They have information. I think I'd take it.
But, Michael, this is not about listening. What Democrats want to investigate is whether President Trump and Rudy Giuliani were actively trying to coerce Ukraine into helping them. Isn't that a very big, or I'd like to think important difference?
I think so. I mean, this is something absolutely bona fide and legitimate to investigate. I don't think it's proper for a campaign here in the United States to accept information from a foreign government or anything that's sort of an ill-gotten gain, so to speak. So I think there's something to these allegations. I don't think it's proper, as the president said, to take these types of leads from other countries. And so this is something that we've got to settle probably, honestly, in the 2020 election.
So if the 2020 election is the only option, Jeremy, does that mean that Democrats have no chance of breaking this impasse and getting the information they want?
I don't know. I think that it's certainly a more interesting case than the one that impeachment has presented, right? Because you have something very tangible and specific here, an allegation from a whistleblower who said that the president of the United States has done something totally improper here. So it's fresh. And I think that what you saw with impeachment, what you've been seeing over the last few weeks as the summer wore on, is kind of a fatigue about it within the Democratic Party. There were Democrats on Capitol Hill now saying, after the Lewandowski hearing earlier this week, that they're really not thrilled at all about the way that they've handled this. And so I think that if you have this type of situation going forward over the next few weeks, where you have a showdown between the White House and Congress over executive authority, over the president's potential misuse of his powers, it kind of adds some juice to a flagging impeachment inquiry.
Michael, you worked on the Intelligence Committee. You think this thing breaks in any way?
I do think that we're going to have weeks and weeks of stalemate. The best Congress and the executive branch work best in history when there is an accommodation around what are the legitimate needs of the Congress and the legitimate needs of the presidency. President Trump practices massive resistance. By the way, I think Adam Schiff and the House Democrats are in a similar posture. And so this is another recipe for stalemate and another reason why I don't think the impeachment proceedings are going to get very far, and we'll have to settle this at the ballot box.
We'll see you in 2020. Thank you all. You definitely got us smarter on a pretty complicated story.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.